Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Claire Noble, the Program Manager with the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. We're now in our 49th year of providing our community with affordable, thought-provoking programs. Our home, Vail, Colorado, is one of North America's premier outdoor recreation destinations. Tonight's topic, globalization, opting out is not an option, with Dr. Richard Haass and Jamie Metzl. Before we get to the program, I just have a few program notes. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find an option for Q&A, and that's where you'll put your comments and questions for tonight's speakers, and I'll share them with the speakers later in the program. Please keep those as concise as possible. Tonight's program runs from 6 until 7 p.m. It is being recorded, and you'll be able to find this recording at vailsymposium.org, Facebook, and YouTube. I'd like to thank tonight's sponsors, the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are being sponsored by Alpine Bank. Technical support tonight is being provided by Joe Kania of Fully Committed Films. I'd also like to thank our generous underwriters. Underwriting tonight's program are Laura Temperi and Brian Stockmar. Underwriting the summer season are Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Mischer. And the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. I'd also like to put a plug in for next week's program. It's a week from tonight. That'll be Thursday, July 2nd, starting at 6 p.m. And we welcome historian and Jefferson Hour podcast creator, Clay Jenkinson. He'll be in conversation with CU professor Thomas Zeiler. And the topic will be Thomas Jefferson, his life and legacy. The timing couldn't be better, 2 days prior to the 4th of July. Dr. Richard Haass is on a mission to create globally literate citizens. In his latest book, The World, A Brief Introduction, Haass provides the essential background and building blocks for globally literate citizens to make sense of our increasingly complex and interconnected world. Dr. Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a position he's held for 17 years. He is an experienced diplomat and policymaker, and he was the senior Middle East advisor to President George H.W. Bush, the staff planning policy advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he was the U.S. envoy to the peace talks both in Cyprus and in Northern Ireland. And he's the recipient of the Presidential Citizens Award, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. He is the author or editor of more than 14 books, best-selling book, including the best-selling book, A World in Chaos. A World in Disarray. Jamie Metzl is the founder of One Shared World. He is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's a novelist, a blogger, a syndicated columnist, and a media commentator, an expert in Asian affairs and biotechnology policy. He served in the U.S. National Security Council, the State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Executive Vice President of the Asia Society, as well as the United Nations in Cambodia. I want to thank both of our distinguished guests for joining us this evening, and I'm going to hand things over to Jamie Metzl.
Thank you so much, Claire and Chris, and to all of my friends in Vail Symposium. When introducing me, Claire, you didn't mention that I've been coming to Vail since I was 3 years old, and so it's nice to be speaking even virtually with so many friends. It's also a real honor and pleasure for me to be with my friend Richard Haass. Richard is, as you mentioned, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I am a proud member. So Richard, welcome, and welcome to all of you. When we look back in our history and we think of 1914 and the bullet that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, a lot of people say, well, that was what started the First World War. But we all know that that wasn't what started the war. That was the spark that lit the fire that had already been set. And that's the same moment that we're in right now, because this virus, this pandemic, isn't the thing that itself broke the world, but it exposed a world that was already breaking in so many different ways. A world where 3 billion people are living in abject poverty, where we keep building these weapons of mass destruction that have the ability to wipe out all of life on Earth, where we're destroying our ecosystems, where our climate is warming. And all of those things became normal for us. And now we're in this moment of incredible crisis. And just like 1918, at the end of the First World War, there were multiple paths. It wasn't, the future was not set. There was a good path. There was a path of the world coming together to solve its biggest problems, perhaps around President Wilson and the 14 points. And there was a worse path, the path of exclusion, of nationalism, of hatred and discord. And as you all know, that was the path that the world ended up taking. And we are at this incredible crossroads moment for our country, where in many ways, the United States, which has kept the peace in the world for at least 75 years, is suddenly on our knees. And the world that we have in many ways created is suddenly at risk. When Richard and I'm slightly, just a little bit younger than Richard, but when both of us started our careers in foreign policy, there was a saying that policy differences ended at the water's edge, that we may have had our differences here at home, but abroad we spoke as a united America with one voice. And what we see now is that is completely gone. But something much more fundamental has also happened. And that is that the world of foreign policy and national security has moved away from being the domain of a relatively small number of elites, all of whom knew each other, to being part and parcel of our political process. And what that means is that regular people, average citizens, have a much greater role to play in making really big decisions. But we haven't matched that role with educating our public and preparing them and preparing all of us for this transformation. And right now we are really suffering because of that. Richard Haass and the Council on Foreign Relations have played for many, many years a central role, not just in being the convening place for foreign policy elites, which is certainly the origin of the CFR. But in many ways, and particularly under Richard's leadership, the process has really opened. The building has opened up, and the organization has recognized that understanding foreign policy has to be all of our problem, because we are all part of the solution. We are all part of making big decisions that will have a monumental impact on not just the future of our country, but because of our special role on the future of our world. And that brings me to Richard and his really fantastic book, which is, I read it, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it's a book to bring the regular voter, the regular citizen, into the process of not just understanding foreign policy and national security policy, but being able to make wise and informed decisions. And in the introduction to the book, Richard, you write about being on a fishing trip and meeting a very bright Stanford student who didn't know anything about foreign policy. Tell us a little bit about that experience and how that led you to write this book.
Well, first, thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Claire. And it's great to be, it's great to be with you, but quite honestly, I'd sure prefer to be in Vail. Let's be honest about that. It's traditionally a highlight of winter and summers alike is to get out to Aspen and Vail. So this is both a great opportunity and a reminder of how things have changed dramatically in the last 4 or so months. The story behind the book is as you say it. I don't pretend to be a fisherman, though every once in a while I like doing it, and the fish celebrate because they seem to be safe whenever I do it. In this case, I was out there with this young man, as you say. He was about to go into his senior year at Stanford, a computer sciences major. And I said, look, I don't know a lot about computer sciences, but I'm curious, what history courses have you taken or what economics courses? And we went through a lot of things. And it turned out essentially he hadn't taken much of anything outside of his area of specialty. And what he had taken was wildly esoteric. And when I went back to my office in New York, I looked at it and it turned out that his experience was actually quite typical. That you can graduate from virtually any high school in the country and virtually any 2 or 4 year college or university. And the courses are offered, but, and it's a big but, they're not required for the most part. So you can navigate whatever distribution requirements might exist, and you can graduate with a degree from a distinguished, prestigious college or university, and essentially know next to nothing about the world that you're going to enter. And as we've learned in all sorts of ways, whether it was on 9/11 with terrorists, or more recently because of what began in Wuhan, or because of what we're seeing as a result of climate change, that you're going to enter this world that will affect your life in fundamental ways, and you're simply not going to have the background for understanding it. And as you suggested, Jamie, we want people not just to vote, but we want people to be informed voters. And voting is not the only act in a political process. We want them to hold their elected and appointed officials to account. We also want people to make wise personal decisions, career decisions, business decisions, investment decisions. And I don't see how you can do that living in the sort of world that we live in and that will continue to unfold in the 21st century unless you have a basic foundational knowledge about the world. And the long and short of it is that I decided to write a book that I hope would provide it in roughly 300 pages. It didn't require a lot of background. I try to avoid jargon. Every time I introduce something, I try to unpack it and explain it. Hopefully I made it interesting. Hopefully I made it intelligible. But the goal was to give people, again, a foundation, a filter, whatever word you want to use, to navigate this flood of information, but also misinformation coming at them.
Yeah. And it's such a critical issue because certainly it matters for Americans understanding America, but because people all around the world rely on the United States for supporting and maintaining and protecting this world that we in many ways created, or at least led the creation of, starting in 1941 and through the war, and this entire wonderful edifice that has allowed this incredible 75-year period of the most impressive economic growth and stability and security with all of the flaws and shortcomings and innovation. It's all at stake. And can America rise to this occasion is a real question. And can regular people who won the First World War and fought the Second World War, can we now rise to this occasion? So, Richard, I want to take us back because you start your book with it, grounding it in some really important dates and historical experiences. And I am like you, and I feel like whenever someone is saying a popular, accessible book and the Treaty of Westphalia in the same sentence, you know that we were going to have to do some razzle-dazzle. But as you write in the book, 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, and the Treaty of Westphalia established the principle of what we now call the modern state. And then we fought the 2 world wars because that balance of power world was inherently unstable in spite of the concert of Europe, and where the countries were always jockeying with each other. And then in 1945, we recognized that we needed to supplement a world of nation states with international organizations. And that's why we and all of those amazing people whose portraits are all around the Council on Foreign Relations helped establish the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods institutions, and all of that. And that's the world that we've lived in for these past 75 years. And the question is, when people look back, when future presidents of the Council on Foreign Relations look back at now, will they say 2020 was the end of the post-war international order? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
No, they won't say that for two reasons. One is we don't know, we can't, predict the future. And second of all, these things don't happen. These are not, history is not about switches. For the most part, history is about rheostats or dials. And there's been a deterioration in the world in recent years for any number of reasons. The gap between global challenges and global responses is large and has grown. You've had shifting power relationships, rising China, an angry Russia, a more capable Iran and North Korea. And more than anything else, you've had an increasingly reluctant America that has essentially chosen, and that's what's so interesting about it, it's essentially abdicated a lot of its traditional role. And as you were getting at, what makes this so critical is we were the principal architect and the general contractor of most of the order in the world over the last 3/4 of a century. And as everybody knows from high school science, organization and order don't just happen naturally. Actually, the opposite. Centrifugal forces tend to take over. So you've had this world, which, as you correctly say, is for all the problems, has been relatively peaceful by historical standards. You've not had a great power war for 75 years. You've had extraordinary improvements in standards of living, extraordinary improvements, increases in duration of life. Many more people are living with some or considerable democracy and freedom. The Cold War ended cold, didn't go hot, and it ended on terms that were wildly in our favor. This has been an extraordinary period of history, but as I said, it has been deteriorating, and I think more than else, it's because we've decided that it's not worth working to sustain, much less expand. I think that's a deeply flawed assumption. I think the benefits of this world have far outweighed any cost, and I think if things do unravel in the world, the cost will far outweigh any savings. So I think it's the trajectory we're on is worrisome. The good news, though, is that nothing in history is inevitable. I've been really lucky for many reasons. One of the reasons I've worked in 4 administrations, and I've seen close up how individuals and decisions, one, are not just not inevitable, but they really matter. So I think the potential exists for things to improve. But the bottom line is they just won't improve by themselves. We can't do it unilaterally, but we need to be part of the answer. And we'll see. We'll see, for example, Jamie, what the lesson is of this pandemic. We could have a United States that would come to realize that our health depends upon global health, and global health can only be improved if we play a large role in it. Or we could continue to say walk away from the World Health Organization and other organizations, and we'll pay the consequences of that. So again, I don't feel that we've reached a point of no return. I don't feel that anything is necessarily baked into the cake, but I don't mean to underestimate the challenges. They are many and they are large. And getting slightly ahead of ourselves, whoever wins this election, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, that inbox that's going to be waiting for them is going to be daunting. The number and the scale of challenges is in many ways unprecedented. And all this is going to take place against a country that's feeling the effects of this virus. Tens of millions unemployed. We're divided politically, where we've got race and other issues that we've not contended with. So this combination of a world that is calling out for American leadership and a country that seems to, at least for now, have lost the appetite for it, that's a really toxic combination.
Yeah, so let's talk about America and then the pandemic. So for the United States, what do you think it's going to take to turn that ship around? I mean, if people have lost their stomach for it, and they lost their stomach for maintaining this role and maintaining this world that we in many ways have helped created through multiple administrations of both parties, certainly we're feeling the pain. And let's just say Joe Biden is elected, the electorate won't change. So how do you think, how can we think about, for those of us who feel the deep necessity for that shift, how do we help make it happen?
It's a really good question, because you're right. If Joe Biden were to win, some of the same forces that Donald Trump has played off of or reinforced will still be there. You'll still have many Americans who are suspicious of certain types of trade agreements. You'll have widespread opposition to certain troop deployments around the world. Many people will say we need to focus on butter. We don't have the luxury of spending money on guns. So I think that's true. But I'd say a couple of things in the other direction. One is, under our political system and under our Constitution, a president has enormous latitude, enormous discretion. Look at the last couple of weeks. The president has taken us out of the World Health Organization, taken us out of the Open Skies Agreement, has talked about pulling 9,500 American troops out of Germany. And over the last couple of years has taken us out of the Iran nuclear deal. We didn't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a long list of things he's done. He's attacked certain allies. He hasn't criticized others and for their violations of human rights. Well, he did all of that on his own. And my point is simply that if we had a president who wanted to do different things, in many cases he could, or she could one day. The discretion and latitude that a president enjoys in foreign policy tends to be greater than anything a president enjoys when it comes to things domestic. So I would think if Joe Biden were elected, he could re-enter certain international arrangements. He could spend some time repairing, I guess is the word I would use, America's alliances. But I take your larger point. He would have to invest some time and effort to persuading the American people that certain types of international endeavors were worth it. And several presidents in history have done that, probably none better than FDR, who dragged in many ways a reluctant United States much closer to support for the Allies and all that on the eve of World War I. I think you saw elements of it with Reagan, elements of it with JFK and others. I think presidents can marshal public opinion to support certain courses in the world, but they've got to invest in it. And so, and in a funny sort of way, Donald Trump has done it in his direction. He doesn't do it with fireside chats. He does it more often than not with tweets. And I would think the next president, if he wanted to, could carve out slightly greater support from the American people, but he would have to take the time to explain, to put it in literal terms, why what happens in Wuhan does matter, or why climate change does pose an existential threat to the United States, or why we can or cannot live with this proliferation or this situation abroad. So I think a president has to educate. And coming back again just for a second to the book, one of the reasons I wrote it is I wanted Americans to be in a position where they could hear such a conversation and come to their own conclusions about whether they thought this made sense.
Yeah. No, you mentioned Wuhan. They're no longer selling the T-shirts that they used to sell saying what happens in Wuhan stays in Wuhan. That was a joke, but when you're in virtual, you can't tell if anybody's laughing, although my parents in Kansas City, I assure you, are. And so it's interesting because there's this whole thing of, does the president lead the electorate or does the electorate lead the president? And my guess is you would say it's a balance, and at different times we need different kinds of interventions. And I think that is this really difficult thing with democracy and with American democracy. And we could survive, as I was mentioning earlier, for a long time not knowing that much about the rest of the world. But whenever Americans travel abroad, I think we all see how well people in other countries understand us. And that's because the decisions that we made here traditionally had much bigger impact on their lives than the decisions than things that happened elsewhere, with some very big exceptions, on our lives. And now I think that the pandemic is a really great example that no longer flies. We live in this interconnected world. All of our fates, as you mentioned, are interconnected. And either we're going to solve our biggest problems together, or we're not. You mentioned WHO. I'm an advisor to WHO, and it's easy to imagine a World Health Organization that could have nipped this pandemic in the bud, but it's not the one that our countries have created. It has more resources, a stronger mandate, a different relationship to countries. And so, but for me, when I think about, well, why don't we have the WHO that we need? It's kind of this, the answer is the same as why don't we have the international structure for addressing climate change or weapons of mass destruction or ecosystem destruction. And you referenced this earlier in your remarks, Richard, that there's this mismatch between global problems, and in many ways, since Westphalia and even after 1945, we're still predominantly organized nationally. And that makes it really difficult because there's a mismatch. So thinking just in terms of superstructure, can we solve our global problems with the systems and structures we have in place? Or do we need to think differently in some ways about how our world is organized?
It's a big question. I should warn you, I never use the word solve, maybe manage. The short answer is no. The model, let me take a step back. I think there's two pieces of fundamental wisdom. One is what happens in the world matters. No country can successfully isolate or insulate itself from it. And second of all, no country can succeed in the world on its own. Every country has reason to partner with any others. So essentially, neither isolationism nor unilateralism, I believe, are viable strategies. But then taking the conversation to the next point, it doesn't mean our model of international collective effort should be the United Nations General Assembly. 192 or 3 countries can't agree on what day of the week it is, much less join forces to accomplish anything. The Security Council can very rarely agree. And the 5 major powers have, or 5 of them, have a veto. And indeed, the UN was structured to be inefficient. The whole idea was major powers would have a veto, so it could not become a vehicle for one great power to use against another. But that also hobbles the UN. But you still have this need for collective effort. So where I come out, years ago, I think I was the one who coined the phrase coalitions of the willing, or there's other phrases like designer multilateralism. Essentially, what we have to come up with are collective, collaborative approaches, but not with everybody. Maybe just with the countries that are willing to get involved, that are able to contribute, and are relevant. And it might mean, for example, take one challenge, climate change. Why in the world should we need to have 193 countries if 10 or 15 account for maybe 75 or 85% of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere and causing climate change? So why don't we focus maybe on getting agreement among those? Well, years ago, we essentially gave up on the World Trade Organization as the negotiating forum for coming up with new trade agreements. The last round ended in failure. Instead, you come up with narrower groupings of countries that are willing to enter into certain types of agreement. And it's not a solution, to use your word, it's not a global outcome. But again, if you can get a big chunk of it, it's doable, and it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. And it could become a model, and it could become a base from which ultimately you bring in others. So my whole approach to multilateralism is more of a selective ground-up approach. And in every dealing with every challenge, whether it's proliferation or whether it's climate change or global health or cyber, what have you, I think we need to think from the ground up practically about who we can begin with, and then we build out from there.
And do you think that approach requires core principles? I mean, one of the things, at least that I see, is this almost de-universalization of values. That the big push in 1945 was we were going to standardize whether it's human rights or social, civil, and political rights. And it seems that we're moving away from that toward this, well, let's negotiate, we'll figure out where is there a common ground. Are we moving away from this idea of core central principles that we can all accept?
I'm not sure. You may still have core central principles, but they're not necessarily going to be universal principles. And an all or nothing approach will end up with nothing, where you'll get people to agree to principles in principle, so to speak, and then in practice they won't do anything. That's what essentially has happened over the last 15 years when it comes to genocides. So again, I don't mind espousing principles as norms, as desirable goals. But in the meantime, I would say you have to run a foreign policy. And then you build coalitions as best you can, as broadly as you can, around enough of those principles as to make it a desirable undertaking, better than the alternative. You really want to think about it like anything else in life as the best available alternative rather than the ideal.
Yeah, and that brings us, of course, to the issue of China, the question of China, which is, as you know, one of the big fundamental challenges, I think at this point is probably the right word for both the United States and for many parts of the world, given that we're entering, if we are entering this world where we're all negotiating with each other, figuring out what's possible, based on at least an element of power, which is how every country enters into these negotiations. How should we think about our relationship with an illiberal country that is so essential to the world and so essential to us, but we are learning every day doesn't necessarily have a similar view to ours about what the future should look like?
No, I think you set it up exactly right. China doesn't have a similar view, either about how countries ought to be run internally, about the relationship between government and governed, the government's role in the economy. They have very different views, and they have different views about the region and in some cases the world. But I think we also have to accept that this is the defining relationship of this era of history. And it's in our interest to avoid confrontation with China. It's in our interest that where we can find limited ways to cooperate, say on climate or health or North Korean proliferation or Afghanistan, that we carve out areas of what you might call selective cooperation, even if they're embedded in a context of disagreement and competition. I think we have to accept, Jamie, that we're not going to transform China. It's not going to be a liberal democracy. It's not going to be a market-oriented economy. So I think we have to accept that, where we see outrageous behaviors on their part, say when they put 1 million people in camps like they are with the Uyghurs, we obviously speak out against it. We may even sanction them over it. But we can't make the purpose of American foreign policy to turn China into a Western-style liberal democracy. It's simply not going to happen. So I would say, again, the challenge there is to try to encourage certain types of Chinese behaviors, discourage other types. And I would think the starting point, besides that degree of realism or recognition about what's doable, is to do it with others. And we're lucky. We have dozens of partners and allies in Asia and Europe. And I would say that's China policy doesn't begin with China. China policy begins with Japan, Australia, India, South Korea, Germany, Britain, France, and so forth. And what we do is try to build a regional and global set of arrangements where China will be incentivized to act in certain ways, to show restraint in certain areas, and will be penalized if it chooses not to. So that would be my approach to China: realistic goals and collective means.
Yeah, so we talked about the United States getting exhausted and an electorate and now a leadership unwilling, not wanting to play the traditional role that America has played. We also see China particularly creating, in many ways, a new pole in the world. A third big area, and you write about it in the book, that's transforming the world is technology. And these major technologies, whether artificial intelligence or as I write about, genetic technologies, genetic engineering, genome sequencing. And it's not just any one of these technologies. What we're seeing is a super convergence of all of the technologies. So each technology propels everything else and is propelled by the other technologies in this exponentially accelerating rate of change. How do you see the future arriving every day faster of technology intersecting with the worlds of foreign policy and national security?
As my children could attest to, I am not a technologist. I need their help operating the remote, or I'd never watch a television show. So let me put that down as my caveat, as Al Haig used to say. In my experience looking at technology through history, most technologies are not one directional. And by that, I mean they have all sorts of potential uses and applications, and depending can be benign or malign. The same technology, depending about how it's used and who's using it, can have very different consequences. And that's true of everything you've mentioned, from AI to genetics. I mean, here we are, we're frantically pushing to get a vaccine. or antivirals that will help us deal with COVID-19. But some of the same people who are in a position to help with that could also cook something up in a laboratory that could be deadly. And one could say the same thing about AI or airplanes or just about anything else. So that's my starting point. I think it's very hard in many cases to set up, particularly for things that can be done in a localized, decentralized way. Those technologies, it's very hard to set up a global governance structure. It's easier in a funny sort of way with big things like nuclear weapons and all that, because the industrial base it takes to produce them, there's only a few places where that can go on. If it does go on, you tend to be able to see it. Whereas some people doing certain things at the edge of cyberspace, that could be very hard to monitor. Some people doing something in a remote laboratory somewhere could be very hard to monitor. Let me say one other thing about the technology, which is one area that we can see coming, and I don't think gets the attention it does, is the technology that drives productivity. And what we've seen in recent years is a massive productivity gains because of robotics, increasingly because of AI, and this is just going to speed up. And we can see where this is heading. And what worries me, it's going to eliminate a lot of existing jobs. And by the way, the pandemic will feed into this because a lot of businesses will be forced out, and a lot of businesses will rethink about their dependence upon living people as opposed to robots or what have you. And I'm worried that in this country and other countries, particularly in Africa, which is the one part of the world that you can see the demographic boom coming, that we don't have in place the training and educational mechanisms to reskill or upskill individuals, to use the jargon, so they're in a position that when the old jobs disappear, they're ready to take the new ones. And I'm worried, I think it's corrosive or worse for any society to have large-scale prolonged unemployment. So this is an area where technology is a challenge, and it can improve the quality of our lives as a whole, but it can really hurt the quality of individual lives. And that's a challenge that, while I can see it coming, I don't think we and other societies are doing nearly enough to prepare for it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things with the pandemic, there were already these trends that were moving so quickly and were displacing people's jobs and livelihoods. But now with the pandemic, it's the way I describe it, it's the future is crashing into the present. Trends that we thought would have played out over years and decades are arriving in weeks and months. And so these disruptions are happening much more quickly than any society can really respond. So I personally feel this is the early stage of this early chapter of the book of this pandemic, and there's a lot more coming. But then one final question for you, Richard, before we go to questions from the audience. One of the problems that we see, certainly now with the pandemic, but so many other things, as you know, I work for Richard Clarke in the National Security Council, and Dick was famous for saying, well, all these things, these are really big threats. And the answer from the government was, yeah, they're big, far off, low probability threats. And we have these things that are just right in front of us that we have to handle. And in so many of these areas, pretty much all of the areas that we've discussed, there's the short term and the long term. There's the doing the best you can as a country and finding a real solution to a problem. And proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is just one example. How do we think about changing the operating system of the world so that we can actually start to solve these existential level threats that we face, but they somehow fall out of each individual person or country's jurisdiction?
Well, we're not going to solve them. Come back to that.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can manage them. In something like climate, you work at different ways. At a minimum, it has two dimensions. One is you try to slow climate change. So that would involve everything from fuel shifting to greater efficiencies. It also means stopping Brazil from destroying the Amazon rainforest and all that. And then secondly, you would have policies that would say, essentially, look, a degree of climate change has already happened. More's baked into the cake. We've got to start building resilience and adapt our societies for it. So it might have implications for insurance policy, for where people live, for building protocols, regulatory regimes, and so forth. It'll affect foreign aid and how you help certain countries that are particularly vulnerable to it. If worse came to worse, you may have to think about what's called geoengineering, to actually look at ways where man-made intervention would try to reverse elements of climate change. But essentially you have a range of responses in almost every international issue I could think about, from terrorism to others. There's an element of trying to prevent it or stop it. There's elements of managing it, building resilience, and there's elements of where you can reversing it. I'll say one thing though. You asked me about the operating system, so let me put on my wonk hat for 1 minute, and I've avoided it now for half an hour, so I apologize now, but let me put it on for 2 minutes. And I want to go back to where you began, Jamie, because you mentioned the wonky phrase Treaty of Westphalia. And the great contribution of the mid-17th century was to introduce the idea of sovereignty, and the idea that countries essentially would become the basic unit of account, and they'd respect one another. And borders would not be changed forcibly. Countries would not be interfering in what happened within the borders of others. And that was a big, big, big innovation. And we know it's a big innovation because when it was violated, terrible things happened, including World Wars I and II. But what's really complicated about this moment in history is that it's still a necessary idea. We saw that when Saddam invaded Kuwait 30 years ago. We see it with Russia, say in Ukraine. It's still a necessary idea. We want sovereignty to be respected, but we don't want sovereignty now to become absolute. For example, on 9/11, we learned the lesson that a country needs to be held accountable if terrorists are operating out of its soil. If hackers are doing things out of a country's territory, they have to take responsibility to stop it. We learned that when Chinese authorities didn't meet their obligations under international health protocols, we pay an enormous price. I just mentioned Brazil. Yes, the bulk of the Amazon rainforest is within Brazil's borders, but does that give them the sovereign right to destroy it if the rest of us will pay a price because climate change will accelerate? So I think one of the challenges for the world is, how do you keep the best of the old operating system, this operating system based upon sovereign respect? At the same time, we understand, because of interconnectedness and globalization, we've also got to put certain constraints on what countries are allowed to do within their borders when those activities cause potential or actual harm to us. That, to me, is a big, big, big diplomatic challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sovereignty, I recognize that Westphalia and the Westphalian system, in many ways, at least certainly in Europe, created more stability. But it could be that this pendulum has swung too far, and that there are just common needs, common aspirations of all humans that we have to address collectively. So with that, I'd like to invite Claire to come back and introduce questions from the audience. Claire.
Claire, have you gone out to get a drink?
Yeah, exactly. So Claire is incredibly fastidious. If Claire is not here, it means that there's a technical issue. Here she is.
Sorry, there was a technical issue,
Yeah.
and I'm back. So first question comes from Ward, and he refers to the comment that the US was the general contractor of the world order for the past 75 years. So he's asking, can the US regain that role in light of the damage Trump has done to the post-World War II world order?
It's a good question. I think the answer is yes. And it's important to remember that general contractor means we're still working with others. So we have partners. And it's the great advantage of American foreign policy is we've got them. We've got them in Europe. We've got them in Asia. We've got some in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. But we're going to have to regain the trust, particularly of allies. I think we've introduced a degree of uncertainty into alliances, and that's poison for alliances, because alliances are predicated upon predictability and reliability. And so I think we're going to have to show that things have changed, and we're willing to not go back exactly to where things were and all that, but essentially to partner with others, both in setting the rules, and then in building the institutions, and then in maintaining and sustaining them. But yeah, I think the world, for the most part, would welcome a more recognizable United States that was once again willing to play a large collaborative international role.
Bob asks, how does one explain the Putin-Trump relationship?
The short answer is I can't. I am painfully familiar with all the theories. I would say a couple of things, though. None of the theories as to what's motivating Mr. Trump, all of which are, shall we say, critical of Mr. Trump, none has been proven. Second of all, I would say that Mr. Trump's generosity, I'll put that word in quotes, towards Mr. Putin is not an exception. He also has it towards Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He has it towards Xi Jinping. He has it towards Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. He has it towards the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. There's a pattern of almost comfort, I'd use that word, of getting along with authoritarian leaders, and his relations with democratic leaders for the most part. The one exception might be Prime Minister Abe of Japan. But his relationship with almost all democratically elected leaders, particularly, say, Chancellor Merkel, has been defined by considerable friction. And so, but after that, into the uniqueness of what might be motivating him towards Russia, I think I can't explain it. I think, though, it's unfortunate. It's caused major problems with Europe. I will say the one other thing in Mr. Trump's defense, whatever his views are, I think overly generous or benign towards Russia, he has done one thing that Mr. Obama never did, which is provide Ukraine with articles for its own self-defense. And I think that was long overdue. And so there, at least, he's taken a policy towards Russia that was something his predecessor wouldn't do. He has introduced, in many cases reluctantly, but he's introduced them all the same, various sanctions against Russia. He's obviously given them rhetorically a free ride on election interference. So I'm not defending his policy. And to be perfectly honest, I don't understand what justifies it, because on balance, I see it as in many cases contrary to our own self-interest.
Bob asks if you would speak to the Iranian-US relationship and your ideas for moving forward.
Yeah, it's a big, tough question. Let me just sort of say, if I were to make a short list of issues over the rest of this year, or say the next 4 months between now and the election, the issues that could become a foreign policy incident, Iran might be at the top of my list. I can imagine a friction between US and Iranian naval vessels. I can imagine Iranian-supported attacks by various militias on American troops in Iraq. I can imagine Iran continuing to go beyond the constraints of the 2015 nuclear agreement, and at some point getting to a point where the United States or Saudi Arabia or Israel would essentially say, we can no longer tolerate that. So if you're looking around the world and you want something to be worried about, I would say in the short run, Iran might be at the top of the list. Look, I was not a major fan of the 2015 nuclear agreement. I thought it was overly generous and unrealistic, and it's generous in its terms and unrealistic in its expectations. That said, once we were in it, to get out of it unilaterally, I thought isolated us more than Iran. What I still think is the challenge now is not to get back in it, because too much of it begins to expire. The ban against arms sales to Iran expires in a couple of months. The certain so-called sunset provisions on things like uranium enrichment and centrifuges and the rest, those begin to expire in 5 years. So we need a longer-term arrangement with Iran. It's no better that Iran would have massive amounts of nuclear materials in 10 years than it should not be acceptable then. So I think we need a long-term agreement. It's something we can only get if we work with the Europeans and others. I think the Chinese and Russians will be very reluctant, to say the least, to join us. It's not exactly clear to me what the path will be diplomatically. But I think our policy with Iran should be based upon trying to limit its capabilities, curb its behaviors, if need be, push back against the things we don't like. I don't think, though, our policy should be based upon trying to overthrow the government. The history of regime change is by and large the history of either failure or unintended consequences. So I would essentially, as much as I have problems with the government of Iran, I would accept it for the time being as a given, And what I would try to do again is put ceiling on certain capabilities and try to discourage certain behaviors, and if need be, respond to them locally.
Neil has asked if you would speak to growth in Africa.
Yeah, it's Africa is really hard to generalize. The 50 plus countries of Africa, south of Sahara, you have success stories and you have anything but. The one thing, though, that is clear about Africa in the future is population. It is the one part of the world that looks to be having, or to be having in the future, an enormous sustained population boom. We're talking about upwards of 1 billion, 1.5 billion people in the next generation or two. And population, can be a blessing. I think in this case, it's more likely to be a burden because Africa already has the experience of high levels of unemployment, particularly for young people. Jamie and I were talking a few minutes ago about new technologies. Africa's population surge is going to come in some ways badly timed because it's going to be at a moment where technologies are going to be replacing what people could do and what workers could do a generation ago. So I worry about Africa dealing with the demands of a heavy population, unemployment. I worry about climate change in parts of Africa. And there's still the problems of corruption and weak governance, particularly in places like Nigeria. I mean, so much of Africa depends upon the future south of the Sahara of South Africa and Nigeria in particular, but also South Africa face real challenges. But I think it's going to be a kind of patchwork quilt sort of a future where certain countries with good governance are going to succeed and others are going to really struggle. So for us, I'll just start to go on so long. I think we can't just have a quote unquote Africa policy, but we need tailored policies to different situations. One of the things we created under the presidency of George W. Bush, 43, was something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And essentially, it's a large bucket of American aid that's given to places if they meet certain conditions. And it's basically a reward and an incentive for good governance and reform. And I think that's the kind of thing that ought to be expanded. I think expanding trade would be help educational opportunities and so forth. But I think we need a large visionary approach to Africa, because otherwise I really worry what's going to happen. And also, it's where climate change again kicks in. Africa will pay an enormous price if we don't do more about climate change.
Earlier in the program, you were talking about the United States, some withdrawing, Russia being angry, China being ascendant. And we also see where countries like Turkey and Poland, where right-wing politicians seem to be coming, or there's countries seem to be retreating from democracy. But when you look around the world, what bright spots do you see? What positive leaders do you see around the world?
Yeah, I should apologize. I'm not the most cheerful guy you could have. So my default option is a little bit of pessimism. I will say in my defense that if you're a pessimist and things turn out badly, you can at least say, I told you so. And if they turn out well, then it's fantastic because they turn out well. But since you asked me to talk about bright spots, I'll give you a few. Look, first of all, look at the last 75 years. The absence of great power conflict, the improvement despite what we're going through now with the pandemic in duration and living and health, lots of diseases stamped out, major increase in living standards, and until 15 years ago, a general advance of democracy. There's been something of a retreat, but for all the problems in recent months and years, still one, not bad. Second of all, Europe. In the last few months, what have we seen? We've seen the real revival of what you might call the European project. You see France and Germany taking the lead bilaterally as well as through the European Central Bank, the European Commission. And suddenly Europe has this big far-sighted policy of dealing with the economic effects of the pandemic. That, a year ago, everyone was basically talking about the demise of Europe because of Brexit. Suddenly Britain's in real trouble and much of the rest of Europe, not so bad. Individual leaders, I think what Germany has done, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, what we're seeing is that there's a number of democratic leaders around the world who have done extraordinarily well. There's a number that haven't. Unfortunately, our own country's not done well. Brazil is doing terribly. But what this suggests to me is the problem's not in the nature of the system, it's in the nature of the leadership. So we see some successful authoritarian systems like Vietnam have done remarkably well, acted early and decisively, at times in ways that we would not accept, I understand, in our kind of society. But we've also seen authoritarians fail terribly, like Iran or Russia. So I think we've seen a variety, but we've seen enough success stories to feel good about that. And again, a lot's going on in the scientific realm. At some point, I think there'll be some breakthroughs, whether they're vaccines or antiviral treatments and all that. We know what to do in many cases. The problem is we're not doing it. But I think the disease has reached a point of manageability if we showed the discipline that is required to do it. I say one other thing, by the way. One of the things I haven't given up on is coming out of this. We'll see. Is whether there is a realization that, and Jamie knows more about it than I do, that the global health machinery is inadequate. And maybe, if you're an optimist, you'd say coming out of this, there could be greater consensus to do something about that. There could be some lessons learned. We know, from previous epidemics that there were things that weren't done that should have been done. Well, hopefully this will provide some impetus to finally get them done.
One of the things you spend some time in your book discussing is the fraught relationship and history between India and Pakistan. But recently, we've seen clashes between India and China along their border. What do you make of this?
They both worry me. I mean, India and Pakistan worry me because they have a history of war, and they both have nuclear arsenals. And if they were part of the world where you said, where is a nuclear weapon most likely to be used, you'd probably come down with India and Pakistan. Because you have these large but not necessarily secure inventories. What always worries me in a conflict, there would be, what we used to say, use them or lose them. There might be pressure to stave off military defeat by threatening or actually using a nuclear weapon. I also worry, particularly in the case of Pakistan, about the deterioration of stability in the country and nuclear weapons getting into the quote unquote wrong hands. So that's one set of concerns. The India-China one is part of, I think, of a larger pattern of a more assertive Chinese policy, whether it's towards Hong Kong, towards Taiwan, towards Vietnam and the South China Sea, now towards India. There's something of a debate going on among the genuine China scholars, of which I am not one, but about whether this is a China that's acting opportunistically to take advantage of a distracted United States and a distracted world, or this is a China trying to distract from its own internal problems, a slower economy, the mishandling of the virus. Obviously, the two aren't mutually exclusive. But whatever it is, I think it's reason for concern. I also think, though, there's opportunity. I've long argued that for a closer U.S.-Indian relationship. I got really frustrated the other day that right in the aftermath of what was going on the border, and India is more open, I think, to certain types of strategic proximity with us and others than it normally has been. Then we issued this new proclamation about visas, and who gets hurt the most? Indians, because the preponderance of H-1B visas was going to Indian nationals. So I think we need to think more strategically, shall we say? And if China is the challenge that the administration and many others think it is, then we have to make that a priority and then look at what we do vis-a-vis in India, or what we do vis-a-vis the South Korean and Japanese alliances, or what we do about Trans-Pacific Partnership and so forth. We need to get our ducks in a row if, again, China is the strategic priority that many people think it is.
We are just about out of time. So I like to end on a lightning round, a quick question to both of our speakers tonight, and that is, what gives you hope?
Well, Jamie, you go first.
Sure. So here's what gives me hope. I feel, and as Richard said, and certainly as I said before, we're in a period of transition, and the systems that we've set up in earlier times just aren't doing the job. Sovereignty has been great in many ways, but we're seeing the limits of a world of sovereign states. The United Nations is amazing, but it's never been allowed to realize its full potential. But with tools like this and these incredible powers of connectivity and literacy, 100 years ago, literacy rate was 20%. Today, it's 85%, and we're connected to each other. And so there is an opportunity, and certainly that's what we're doing with One Shared World, but it's broader than that. There's an opportunity for regular people to come together and build in meaningful ways a better world for everyone. In 1941, the only strategy here was support FDR. Now we're going to divide up the job of being FDR, and everybody has a role.
Yeah, my answer is not that different. There's enough successes in recent history. It's not as though there's a limited supply and we've used them up, our quota. People can do smart things in government, I'd say that, and we've seen it many times. Dean Acheson titled his memoir, Present at the Creation. I don't think we've been nearly as creative as we could or should be, but the opportunity is there. I don't think the U.S.-Chinese relationship is in any way inevitably or inexorably a Cold War. I just don't buy that. I also look at domestic change in this country. I mean, look at how much we've changed on certain issues, whether in recent years about gay marriage, about women, and just in the last few weeks after the killing of George Floyd. I actually think it shows the potential for change, not just in the United States, but around the world. So I'm a pessimist, but I'm never a defeatist. And I think there's an important distinction. I do believe in the, what people can accomplish, whether domestically or internationally. So I ain't giving up at all, Claire.
Dr. Richard Haass, Jamie Metzl, thank you both for sharing your expertise with us and your time with us this evening. Thank you very much. And Dr. Haass, please also thank Doreen Bonamy, because this program wouldn't have come together without her assistance.
Much would not come together without her, trust me.
Everyone, thank you so much, and I hope we'll see you next week, Thursday, July 2nd, where we do our program on Thomas Jefferson. Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jamie.
Everybody. Thanks, Richard. Bye.